All right, so the next thing I want to talk to you about this week is I want to give you a very, I hope, relatively short lecture on socialization in the life course and how important socialization is to societies. So, when you think about how societies are formed and then create solidarity and continue over time, we often have to socialize the members of our society, right? Socialize them into the norms, the rules, the laws, the cultures, the customs. And so, socialization is profoundly important. In fact, I'm a demographer, a family demographer, and there's this one demographer I love his writing about it. He talks about the importance of socialization for society, and the way he discusses it, his name is Norm Ryder. The way he discusses it is he says that every year barbarians are added to society, and the barbarians want to destroy society. They don't know the language, they don't know the custom, they don't know the rules, they are just total rebels. And that he's, of course, talking about babies. That when babies are born, they don't know the language, they don't know the customs, they don't know the culture, and that every generation of adults and parents has an interest in socializing those children, socializing them into the family customs and family traditions. The school systems have an interest in socializing them into the values and beliefs of the wider society. Other institutions, like the legal institutions and the police, have an interest in making them be good citizens. The military might want to socialize some of them to become soldiers and defend their country. And so, of course, we're interested in socialization. We want to socialize people. And so, this little lecture is going to talk to you about the socialization process and how sociologists care about it, some theories of socialization, some of which I've already kind of briefly mentioned to you. What are the important agents of socialization in our life? And then what are moments in life when we become re-socialized, that we're learning things and then we're expected to relearn or be socialized in a different way. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about rites of passage. And that is moments in our socialization that are so important that our society wants to stop and take a moment and celebrate or have a ceremony to honor, the socialization, and to say that once we accept the socialization, we have changed ourselves. We have become something entirely different. So that's the rite of passage. So what do I mean when I talk about socialization? Well, I'm talking about a lifelong process where we learn the attitudes and values and behaviors appropriate for members of a particular culture. And so what is it to be a family member? What is it to be a daughter, and then a young woman, and then a married wife, and then a grandmother? And so you think about how this is a lifelong kind of socialization process. And that roles, we're socialized into roles, and that roles are expected behavior associated with a given status in society. And so it's through socialization that people absorb their culture, the customs, the habits, the laws, the practices, the ways we express ourselves, and that socialization becomes the basis for identity. So I know in my own family, my mother and father were really very carefully socializing me to understand what they thought womanhood was, and what being a good daughter is, and a good sister, and being a good citizen. And my parents really socialized me to value education. And so they're really trying to kind of show me what they thought all of that meant. My father was a hippie in the 60s and 70s. And so he was also trying to socialize me into being an independent thinker, to think for myself. And so you can think about what kind of socialization have you received over your life? Who has taken a strong interest in your socialization, and how you now use that in your young adulthood as a basis of identity? Like, who do you think you are based on the socialization you've had? So what are the consequences of socialization? One, obviously, it establishes your self-concepts, who you think you are as a person, what you think your worth is and your value, and what your attitudes are. It creates the capacity for role-taking. And so if you're socialized to take on roles and responsibilities, maybe you're socialized to be concerned about taking on family roles. Maybe you've been socialized to be an employee and work hard. Maybe you've been socialized to be willing to sacrifice for your country. Or maybe you've been socialized to be a flexible person, to take on a variety of different roles. And so basically, socialization is about teaching you what are roles in society, how can you change one role for another, how can you assume roles, how can you leave roles, what does that process mean? And so basically, socialization also kind of creates the tendency for people to act in socially acceptable ways. And so when I go home, I know that my mother's expecting me to help prepare meals and help clean up. She's expecting me to want to go to the nursing home to see my father. She's expecting me to keep in communication with my sister, to want to visit with my nieces and nephew, to write letters to the extended family, to write and care for people when they're in the hospital. And so my mother has a really strong vision about what it is to be taking on the role of a daughter in a family, right? And so you can think about that. We behave in socially acceptable ways because of our socialization. And if all of this works out well, we don't even really question it. We become the bearers of culture. And so when I make meals for my friends, I try to cook the meals that my mother has taught me and trained me to believe are, the meals that show caring and love. When I celebrate the holidays, I want to do it in a specific kind of way. When I become a teacher and I go into the role of teacher, I'm trying to think of all the role models I had in my past and what they socialized me to believe about what teaching is. And so we end up kind of like bearing the culture, and we start taking on the role of socializing others. So that's an important part of socialization itself. We become members of society who want to socialize the people who come after us. And so when we're thinking about it, we're talking about the self, socializing the self. And I've talked about this before as I've talked about symbolic interactionism, that the self is our sense of who we are, distinct from others, and shaped by our unique social interactions. And that basically the self is not a static phenomenon. We're changing our sense of who we are over time. We develop ourselves and change throughout our lives based on the challenges we face or the challenges we take on or the things that happen to us. So over my life, I've kind of been a daughter, and now I'm an independent person. I've taken on the role of somebody who's active in politics and taken on the role of being a junior professor, and now I'm a full professor. And so my sense of myself has changed over the time. And the same will happen with you. And so Charles Horton Cooley talks about this as the looking glass self. And so he says, hey, we learn who we are by interacting with others. Remember I talked about this in the very first lecture of our last week. And that the self is a product of our social interactions with other people. And that we can think of three kind of phases in our development of self-identity. One is we imagine and think about how people might see us. Like when I think about when my best friend thinks about me, what does she think I am as a person? And so then we imagine how others are going to evaluate and judge us. So we get kind of a sense of, this is how I think my friend thinks of me, so this is how I think she must judge me or see me. And so then we end up defining ourselves as a result of this. So we look out and see how people are judging us, and we define ourselves because of it. And so basically he kind of thinks about society as a looking glass self, right? We get a sense of our self-identity by thinking through how other people judge us. George Herbert Mead is also somebody who kind of thinks about it as identity as a social construction or a symbolically interaction, something created symbolically in interaction with others. And what he says is that your development of the self, your self-identity, is through a two-part system. One is there's the I, and the I is the part that acts out things, that does things, right? You go to class, you raise your hand, you go for a job interview, you ask someone out on a date, you text your friend an image, like this person who does something. And that the me is the socialized self that sits there planning out your actions and judging your performance of actions based on standards we learn from others. And so if you raise your hand in class and you ask a question and people laugh, then you think, oh my God, I asked a stupid question, and you judge yourself for it, right? And so we have these two components. The person does the action, and the person who's judging the others or has a sense of what society is thinking about them. And so that means that we're really interested in significant others, that people, the individuals who we think are the most important in our life, like our parents and teachers and friends, are extremely important in our development of ourself, right? Of how we think about ourselves. We're taking their judgments about our performances, their standards into our thoughts about who we are. And so when we first start out as young people, we really are concerned with our parents, our teachers, our friends, our pastors, people who are really intimately involved in our life. And so George Herbert Mead, he really kind of looked at how do we see children socialized into society? And he thought it was like a 3-step process for children. And so the first step was like the preparatory stage. And this is for very, very young children. And it's when children start imitating the people around them, especially family members. And they kind of do it really symbolically. And so they start doing gestures and using objects or words that the people around them are using. And so, for example, when a mother comes home from work and she puts down her briefcase and kicks off her heels, maybe the daughter will come, the little young toddler will come in, and she'll pick up the briefcase and put on those high heels and just start walking around. Or if the father's cooking dinner and on the stove, his daughter or son, young toddler, might be banging on pots and pans, or might have a toy stove. And so they don't really even know what these roles are, but they're kind of just mimicking people, right? And that's the preparatory stage. The children are acknowledging that people around them are enacting roles. And then there's a stage where children start pretending, they start playing. And this is when they start taking on roles. So they start, mentally assuming the perspective of another and responding from that imagined viewpoint. And so they start saying, like, oh, I'm going to try to be like a nurse, or I'm going to try to be like a doctor, or I'm going to try to be like a cowboy or an Indian, right? And they take on the roles and they enact the roles and they're playing them. And then the final stage for children, for little older children, our children begin to understand that these roles are related to each other. And so a nurse needs a patient, and a patient has a role. A mommy needs a daddy. A parent needs a baby. And then you start seeing children interacting with each other within those roles. And so a child might say, I'll be the doctor, you be the nurse. And they enact and play out the roles that they think that they imply. And what he says is that this is the way that children are kind of learning about how society might be looking at them. And so I'll give you an example in my own life. When I was in graduate school, I lived with a variety of people, my very best friends. I lived with a woman and I lived with 3 other men. So there was the 5 of us, right? And so one Christmas, we decided to have a Christmas party. And we wanted to have eggnog and all of that. But we wanted to have a Christmas tree. It was around finals week and we wanted a Christmas tree. And so we went to a place to get a tree, and it was the 5 of us there, and the tree had kind of a ragged bottom. And so we took a saw from the person who was selling it to us, and I was bent down cutting off the ragged edge with the saw, right? And so this little girl, she had to be only like 3 or 4, she was with her dad. She turns around and she sees my 3 men friends standing around me watching me cut this tree, right? And she comes running up to me and puts her hand on my arm and goes, let the man do it, let the man do it. And so you can see that she was really kind of concerned with I wasn't doing the role right? And so as a child, she was kind of understanding a man is supposed to be the tree cutter. And so maybe now, if I were doing it now, that was a long time ago, that she wouldn't even see any problem at all with the woman doing it, but it was kind of funny. Anyway, so he says that children, these are their ways of learning roles, practicing roles, learning that roles are interacted with people, and that what this is all about is learning about the generalized other. And that the generalized other is the attitudes, viewpoints, and expectations of society as a whole that a child takes into account in his or her behavior. It's so important that I've even put it on twice on this slide, because I want you to kind of think about that. That when we're first born and raised in our youngest days, we're really concerned with significant others and what they think of us and how they're showing us roles. But if they're socializing us right, we end up being concerned with a generalized other, that we know how to act in the regular society, that when we go out and we meet new people, we don't sit there thinking, what would my mother want me to do? That we know how to behave with people. We know how to be courteous. We know how to be polite. We know how to engage, right? And so it's not that significant others will become less important in our life. It's just that we start acknowledging that, hey, I can take on a role or I can put down a role, but I'm responsible for knowing the content of roles. And so that's kind of interesting, I think. So again, I've talked to you about Irving Goffman, right? And about the dramaturgical approach. And so he says that people are really kind of concerned with how they present themselves in public, how they present themselves in interactions. And so his research is looking at interactions as though people were actors on a stage. And you'll remember I talked to you about the front stage versus backstage behavior. And the backstage behavior is how we might behave just to satisfy ourselves, or how we might behave in order to prepare for how we're going to be in public. But our front stage behavior is how we behave when we're public in interaction with others. And that he says is that we're engaged in kind of 2 processes. One is basically impression management, that we're altering our presentation of self to create a distinctive kind of appearance to satisfy particular audiences. So how you might behave when you meet President Maisie might be different than how you'll behave in your dorm room with your roommate. How you behave in front of somebody who's a religious leader in a community might be different than how you would behave with your best friend on a Friday night. How you might behave if you met President Trump would be different than how you behave if you met the mayor of Bowling Green. And so we are kind of tailoring our behaviors to create a certain kind of impression. And then it's interesting to see our social choices about that. And then he says another important process is face work. that we're really interested in trying to avoid embarrassment, right? And so if we do something that we think might humiliate or shame or embarrass us, we engage in face work to try to get over it, to make amends for it. And so we might do something like act like we didn't mean to do it, or act like you meant to do that to cover it, or maybe we might give a gift to whoever we've done something embarrassing to, that we're really interested in avoiding the shame of whatever we did that we think was a bad appearance. Okay, so of course it's important to think about who socializes us in society. There's primary socialization and secondary socialization. So primary socialization is long-term people who socialize you, who have a long-term, enduring interest in you. They are intimately involved with you. They expect to be with you over the course of time. The socialization and the relationship is a lot more connected and personal. And so there's that kind of socialization. And then there's secondary socialization, where you are with people who are expected to be with you, maybe for a long time, maybe for a shorter time, and that they're interested in you, but they're interested in you for a particular reason, and they don't necessarily need or expect a level of intimacy. And so, for example, primary socialization is your family and maybe your best friends. Education is a socialization institution. Religion socializes you. Your peers do, mass media, the workplace. So when I go to work, I'm socialized in how it is to be an employee, be on time and be polite, be prepared for your students. And so we have all these different kinds of institutions that are socializing us. So there might be moments in our life when we need to be resocialized, or when we are resocialized. And so that's when your existing roles are altered or replaced. And often resocialization occurs in really highly strict, controlled settings. So for example, in the military. If you've joined the military, like you go to boot camp, they're trying to strip your previous socialization from you, right? They take away your civilian clothing. They cut your hair so that your hair looks like everyone else's. They make you do everything at the same time as everyone else. They don't call you by your personal name, and certainly not your pet name. They call you by a number. They scream at everyone all the same. And so they're trying to kind of make you learn what it is to be a soldier and to be like every other soldier. If you go to prison, in prison they're going to re-socialize you about what it is to lose your liberty, what it is to be at the mercy of the warden and the jailers, right? If you join a cult, the cult is certainly going to try to re-socialize you. And so you kind of think about this like moments when an agent or an institution really wants to change you. Okay, so another thing I want to talk to you about is anticipatory socialization. And so that's the process of socialization in which you rehearse what you think is going to happen in the future. Okay? So, for example, when you go on a job interview, you might rehearse what you're going to say or rehearse talking about your achievements. And that would be kind of anticipatory socialization. You might think through what kind of clothes you want to buy in order to go on that interview. And it's interesting to watch people do that. Watch people go through anticipating a new role that they're taking on and reshaping themselves for it. Okay? Now, in specific, I really want to talk to you about degradation ceremonies. And so, again, we were talking about a moment ago places that really are trying to re-socialize you and change you. And there's a sociological term for an institution that would do that. They call it a total institution. And a total institution is an institution that controls every aspect of your life, and it controls who you do it with. And so they control when you eat, what you eat, who you eat with, what you do, when you do it. They're not given any choice about things, right? And so examples would be prisons, the military, mental institutions, maybe a convent, places that really are regulating all aspects of a person's life, under a single authority. Sometimes these total institutions, they engage in degradation ceremonies to kind of re-socialize people. And so that includes kind of subjecting people to kind of humiliating rituals, right? And so, for example, I talked to you about how sometimes in the military they might call you, a derogatory name for somebody who's a new recruit, right? Or if you're joining a fraternity, they might have a really derogatory name for a pledge. Or a prison, they might call you a snitch to try to really teach you that you should never ever, turn your back on being quiet and not causing, don't cause trouble. And so these degradation ceremonies are really kind of useful in a way for trying to get people to give up their previous socialization. Okay, and so sociologists often study them. The last thing I want to talk to you about when we think about socialization are rites of passage. And so I talked about this earlier at the very start. A rite of passage is a major transition point in your socialization. It's a ceremony or ritual that marks the transition of an individual from one role to another. And so basically, a rite of passage defines and legitimizes an abrupt role change. You're beginning a new part of your life and you're ending another. And so, an example would be a wedding. If you've ever attended a Jewish wedding ceremony, they often have a moment in the ceremony where the groom smashes a glass, right? He steps on a glass and he shows that I'm breaking from my family where I was just a son and now I'm forming my own family and becoming a husband. And so a wedding ceremony is showing, like here, we are bringing these witnesses together to show that we are no longer just a man and a woman. We are now a husband and a wife. Other examples would be graduation ceremonies. And so I know that you are looking forward to when you graduate and you're going to take your mortar board off your head and you're going to throw it up in the air to show the rite of passage of becoming a college graduate, an alum of a university. And so I would like you to think through, different cultures treat young adulthood differently, like the movement from being a child to an adult. So, for example, there's some African tribes where people are isolated and they go through a ceremony, and after the ceremony, they are recognized as an adult. In Amish people, young people are not permitted to have beards, but a man that has a beard shows that he is an adult. So we have these like abrupt markers. And so I'd ask you to think through is, do we have an abrupt marker, a rite of passage that clearly shows that someone is no longer an adolescent, that they are truly adult in U.S. culture? In your mind, what would that look like? And that's the little words for thought I have for you today. You take care.